You have to have both, in my experience. In deep realization, you have to be willing to do shadow work, but you also have to be really, really willing to continue to honor the insight. The two components to stable, deep realization. As I often say, this first shift I talk about, Kensho, is, I know this frustrates a lot of people, but it's a relatively simple and a relatively easy thing. Often feels quite like a freebie, although it does take a profound degree of surrender and a willingness to go beyond the mind, which can be very sticky for people and take quite a while to really get what that means and be ready for it. But the shift itself and the insight is rather straightforward, rather simple, although it is truly life-altering. But when I talk about deep stages of realization, which more and more people now are realizing, which is wonderful, it does take work. It takes some effort on your part. It takes some surrendering in areas you didn't think you'd have to surrender. It takes some deep trust in this process. It takes some flexibility. So to stabilize, and I'm talking about the people I see who are able to do this, stabilize in this space of realization, there are two components to it. And I think without either one, well, without the first one, of course, it's a moot point, and that is insight. Again, without that first shift, I've seen people who talk about deeper realization because they've read about it, but they haven't had a shift, and it stays intellectual, and they can really fool themselves. You have to have the direct insight and the deepening insights as they tend to unfold beyond that first shift. The insight is critical. Without that, forget about it. We're not talking about deep stage realization. But the other component that, as I often mention, can definitely be overlooked. It often is overlooked. And for good reason. It's a lot of our psyche, a lot of our conditioning, a lot of our ego structure, for lack of a better way of saying it, is set up to avoid this. It is set up to not see a lot of this, not want to do a lot of this, because it's obscure sometimes, it's hidden from us, it's shadow material, and it's uncomfortable. So the second component is essentially shadow material or shadow work or deep emotion work. Luckily, there are a lot of ways to approach this, and now we have really good pointers. We have good modalities. We have a lot of people who are facilitated in this and can help you through things. Also, the sort of taboo around this in deeper realization is, I think, dissipating. So I think in the past there was a taboo that like, oh no, realization is a way to sidestep all of that stuff, right? With deep realization, you don't ever need therapy, or you don't ever need to do emotion work, or you don't have emotions or something like that. And that's just straight wrong. It's just not like that. So don't be fooled. But I've also said, Buddhism, probably all the direct paths, including Hindu direct paths and so forth, I think they notoriously kind of avoid this part, or I don't know if they avoid it. They don't address it, largely. Now, I'm sure there are some schools, some teachers, some temples that, for whatever reasons, have good support in these areas. But to not address the emotional aspects, to not address the shadow aspects and the shadow of the person aspects of this when somebody's moving through realization is a kind of miss. And what ultimately that results in, we could argue about whether that's true or not, because I'm sure there are people who don't actually believe that, and that's fine. But what ultimately that results in, from what I see, is difficulty stabilizing in deep realization. A lot of turmoil, a lot of confusion, a lot of up and down, a lot of meing and being, a lot of kind of re-identifying in some ways with mind, but calling it spirituality and things like that. So it can be very confusing unless you really embrace both aspects. And you do have to embrace both aspects. You have to embrace the willingness to do deep emotion work, and you also have to embrace the willingness to let the insight continue as it needs to continue, not as you want it to continue, not as you think it should continue, to keep you from feeling certain fears, which touches right back into the emotion work. So what can happen is sometimes people can have insight, can have an initial shift, but they strangely this is where insight is critical. They can use the idea of doing shadow work, and they do shadow work. They may do emotion work, shadow work, etc., to various degrees, but there are certain shadow spaces they just aren't willing to go, like certain fears, existential fear, for instance, things like that. And then the whole thing gets co-opted. So there is shadow work being done, but it's kind of, I think my Zen teacher used to say something like, he likened it to, there's a saying in law where if you the person who represents themselves in court has a fool for an attorney, something like that, right? You don't self-represent in court, you hire an attorney. He said sort of the same thing. If you represent yourself, or if you're the one in charge of your own spiritual awakening, you kind of have a fool for a teacher. And what he was essentially saying is it helps to have a teacher. It helps to have somebody who's ahead of you on this path, or who has walked this path before you, and or just someone to check in with, or more than one someone to check in with to really see what's going on and to get feedback you may need. But the gist of it is intact of that message, and that is the problem itself is the one that's leading the charge, right? The ego itself, again, so to speak, the ego is the one that's running the spiritual journey at this point, right? It's making it comfortable for itself and conveniently overlooking certain insights that you may not be ready for, or you may not be willing to look into or accept the fact that those are part of this process, that this process does continue to go beyond anything you could imagine, anything you could want in certain ways, because it goes beyond the apparatus of all illusion, right? The apparatus that holds illusion together. And one of the fundamental illusions is the illusion of otherness, the illusion of the future, these things that keep our mind revved up and going, trying to create or recreate or stabilize ourselves in the identified mental world. And when that starts to come apart and starts to collapse, it can get scary, right? So then we can even cling to this idea of shadow work and so forth. So this is why both are important. You have to have both. In my experience, in deep realization, you have to be willing to do shadow work, but you also have to be really, really willing to continue to honor the insight. And what I see then is the shadow material, that space that you move through when doing this kind of work and the emotion work, is a little bit more of a temporary way station. It doesn't mean you'll ever be completely done, or you should never tell yourself, oh, I'm done, I'll never feel anything again, or I'll never feel an afflictive emotion, or that's not a good idea. But you do move through the vast majority of it, and then on the other side, things get very quiet, they get very equanimous, and then the insight is clear and stable. But to move through all of that, you really have to be willing to go where you need to go with both the shadow material and with the insight itself. And so this is why I say these two components are critical in deep state realization if you want stability.